ocean contracts in time of pandemic. Topic of my conversation today with Gordon Downs. He is CEO of NYSHEX. Hello, Gordon.
Hello, Bob.
Thank you very much for being with me. I really appreciate it. What are the main problems as you see it that retailers and other importers are currently encountering with ocean service contracts?
So one of the big challenges, it's very difficult to get a service contract these days. The supply of capacity in the market has been limited because of all the bottlenecks, and the demand for freight to move into the United States is also expanded. So the challenge for a lot of retailers and other folks looking to make ocean contracts is it's quite difficult to contract supply. Coupled with that, it's also very difficult to get a contract where there's firm commitments as to the price and firm commitments as to the service. Mm-hmm. And these are pretty big challenges, because if you're trying to build a resilient supply chain, if you have a contract that allows either party to break the terms of the contract or either party to unilaterally change the price, it can have a very negative impact on supply chain reliability.
Are you saying, in fact, that carriers won't even sit down with shippers and retailers now to negotiate, or it's just hard once they sit at the table to get something actually negotiated?
So what we found is, the carriers, of course, value their customers and are very happy to sit down and negotiate, but they only have a finite amount of capacity. Mm-hmm. And so what we've seen is the carriers have really prioritized generally speaking, prioritized their existing customers to make sure they protect those first rather than taking on new customers at the expense of existing customers. And we've also seen that the shippers who contract a little earlier in the cycle mm-hmm. have been more successful in getting space. In fact, just coincidentally, in the 2021 contract season, a lot of the shippers waited until the end of the season in the hope that the prices would soften, and when they got to the end of the contracting cycle, essentially a lot of that capacity had been sold up and they were stuck.
Good luck on, yeah.
So that I think has prompted a lot of shippers to bring their contracting cycles forward, and as a result, a lot of carriers have been essentially selling all the capacity that they have available, mm-hmm. and so that by the time folks come later in the contracting cycle, there may not be the available capacity.
But the question has always been asked, is there truly any service in service contracts? Is it worse now in the pandemic, or is this just a long-standing point of tension between shippers and carriers that we've seen for all these years?
Yeah, it's such a controversial topic and a heated topic. People sort of are very emotional about this. Mm-hmm. Look, I think that carriers have desire to provide good service to their customers. I mean, that's very clear. I mean, there are some constraints, and I think those are, many of them are related to the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. For example, being able to move goods through terminals, and many of those are also knock-on effects through labor shortages and in the warehouses and the trucking markets, etc. So there are controllable factors within the carrier's control that they're of course doing everything they can to optimize, and then there's factors outside of the carrier's control which are hard to change in the short term. Now, of course, you can make investments and so on in order to improve service in the longer term horizon, but in the short term it can be very difficult to get around those bottlenecks. Mm-hmm. So I think, look, it's hard to say there is no service in service contracts. Of course, the cargo is moving, but I think that what a lot of shippers might argue is that because the carriers have consolidated, and as you probably know, there are 3 big alliances, and all the carriers have sort of formed into those 3 alliances. Mm-hmm. In general, the ocean service is now sort of standardized depending on the alliance. Of course, mm-hmm. If you're booking with one carrier on the alliance or another carrier on the alliance, you're essentially on the same ship, assuming right. you're mm-hmm. shipping in the same week. So there's not much service differentiation there, but what we are starting to see is carriers are now differentiating on the types of contracts that they provide. They're differentiating on the pre and post ocean landside services, etc. So there are elements to service around the contract, as it were, but the actual core ocean movement, quite frankly, the alliances have made it a little difficult, I should say, to differentiate.
But what I mean is guarantee of any service whatsoever. For instance, what's the point of a service contract if the carrier is, number one, going to roll your cargo because they don't want to put in that ship, it goes on the next ship. Number two, going to blank the sailings and not have the sailings happen at all. On the shipper side, what's the point if a shipper says, hey, I got a better price in the spot market, never mind about that commitment I made to you. In both sides walk away from commitments. How do we even have a service contract?
I completely agree with you, Bob. I think it's a real head scratcher. Just thinking back a little bit, mm-hmm. part of the reason why shippers created, or at least put so much effort into building out these service contracts and investing in long RFQ processes, etc., was because, of course, it's a big spend, mm-hmm. The ocean freight spend, and so therefore it justifies
big now.
Yeah,
With the rates
much
being
bigger
what they
now,
are,
of
yeah.
course. But
Yeah.
but even pre-pandemic, it was still a big spend for a lot of these importers, and so therefore they allocate the procurement professionals to go in and run the process. There's also a regulatory requirement that these contracts get filed, so you have a rate on file with the Federal Maritime Commission. So there's that element. But the other thing is that for a lot of the softer years in the market, the service contract allowed a shipper somehow to use a free call option. So in other words, when the prices went down in the spot market, a lot of shippers would take advantage of cost-saving opportunities and shift volume onto lower priced spot contracts or NBOs or what have you.
Right.
And then when the spot prices went up, then they would book on the service contract, and it's essentially a free call option. And I think that was entirely possible in the years where the market was quite soft. Now, of course, that's not possible. But I think the legacy use of a service contract from a shipper point of view was primarily around being able to contain your cost, and technically it's a free call option. Now it's something different, and it's really important that those problems with the service contract where they can be broken by either side, those have to be fixed, because there's been so many, I would say, accusations that we've seen in the media now that there's all these supply chain bottlenecks where shippers are accusing carriers of price gouging, and of course the media picks up on this and it becomes headline news. And the reality is that it's not necessarily price gouging. It's just that in an industry where there's a shortage of supply and excess demand, prices of course go up.
It's the law of supply and demand.
Absolutely.
That's all it is.
And the fact that a shipper had a contract that had a pre-agreed price doesn't guarantee them any service or commitment from a carrier. So the carrier does have that flexibility to optimize the ship by taking on as much high-paying spot cargo as they can. And of course, I can see how you can make the case that that is price gouging, but in reality, that's just how the industry has operated for so long. But the point still remains, the industry has to solve this problem, especially now, because this pandemic has fundamentally changed the way I think the carriers are starting to operate and the way that they function in alliances and balancing capacity, and it's definitely changed the way shippers start to think about their supply chains, optimizing for resilience versus optimizing for cost savings, etc. So in order for supply chain professionals to navigate in this new sort of environment, I think it's critical that we solve this particular problem you highlighted.
Okay, so what can retailers do to protect themselves?
So the good news for retailers is there are a lot of new product innovations around the contract itself. For example, most carriers are prepared to offer a two-way committed contract. Sometimes that's a short-term contract, sometimes that's a long-term contract. So these are new innovations which I think are very, very exciting, and I think most supply chain professionals should be paying attention to. How to take advantage of this? This is the complicated part, because when you're making a two-way committed contract, it requires the shipper to commit to loading the cargo, just as it requires the carrier to commit the equipment and the capacity.
Right.
So in the past, no one really made commitments to that extent, and this requires a different look at the supply chain. And basically, supply chain professionals, what we've seen is the ones that do this right, look at their supply chain and take out those lanes where they have predictable cargo flows and lock that in. And lanes where they don't have the predictable cargo flows, those are the lanes that you might not want to lock in because you may be in a position where you're contracting for something you don't deliver, and then there may be penalties
So no
associated
solution,
with that.
no one solution to all of your lanes.
Exactly.
Particularize it.
So, and it's a big shift, because in the past, the shippers really didn't pay that much attention to delivering specific commitments to carriers, just in general. There are exceptions, of course, but that's how it was. And so there wasn't really this need, or the work wasn't put in to really figure out what are those lanes that require those commitments. And now I think from a supply chain professional point of view, there's a need to be able to use the data, look at the historic patterns, look at future purchase order patterns, etc., and to try and do that analysis. But it's a different skill set, basically.
This is a really complex issue. It's been going on for years, but it's more interesting than ever before. Gordon, thanks so much for your insights into this world of ocean shipping contracts. But at this point, I would just very quickly turn to just a brief discussion of NYSHEX itself. Where do you fit into this whole picture, and what are you folks doing in this era of crisis and change and complexity?
So we're on a mission to make shipping more reliable by fixing the contracting problem. And we do this through technology and basically digitizing the process of creating the contract, so that the terms in the contract are nice and clear, systematically captured, and then integrating into the carrier systems, in many cases the shipper's TMS systems, to extract all the data on what is actually happening in the supply chain. And if the commitments that are made in the contract are being delivered or not, and if they're not, where are the breakdowns taking place and who's responsible for that? And then we've built the coordination layer around resolving exceptions. So if something goes off track, there's a process in which these exceptions get flagged, the relevant stakeholders use the application to, first of all, identify what happened, and second of all, to take a corrective action to get it back on track. So it's a very complicated problem, as we've just spent some time talking about, but the good news is, I think, the mindset of the major players on the carrier and the shipper side, and even the NBOCC side, is changing in favor of this, so there's a sort of will to embrace new technologies and new methods, and so we're seeing a lot of adoption and a lot of success. And just to put a number on that, the average contract fulfillment or contract compliance rate is around 62%.
62, you say?
62, it's quite sad when you think about it.
Yeah.
Yet when we see shippers taking advantage of the technology we've developed, and carriers of course, that compliance rate is 98%. So it's an enormous increase in terms of driving resilience and reliability across the supply chain.
So you're in the right place at the right time, it sounds like, at a very interesting point of change and transition. Thanks a lot, Gordon. I really appreciate it sitting down with me to talk about the whole issue of ocean carriers and contracts, as well as a little bit about NYSHEX itself. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bob.
I've been speaking with Gordon Downs of NYSHEX. Thank you very much for watching.